Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'm going to be discussing how the government this week are preparing to remove our fundamental democratic right to protest. Nothing to do with coronavirus measures. This is intended to be permanent. But when I started to plan to talk about this last week, I could not imagine that an event would take place that brought into sharp focus just how important these rights are and how easily they can be denied by authoritarian behaviour. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So I'm going to begin with my views on the heavy-handed police action this weekend that has, I note, been roundly condemned by all parties. That includes a personal condemnation from the same Conservative Home Secretary who is now pushing legislation through Parliament to remove our right to protest. So last week, as International Women's Day shone a spotlight once again on how much harassment women face on a regular basis, for any men who wanted to listen, we were told that when women go out, they're told to mind how they dress, to only walk with a friend, to hold keys between their fingers in case they need a weapon, carry a panic alarm, and so on. I've never had to consider any of these things. Sure, I've walked home late at night at various times in my life, and of course you're a little bit mindful of certain routes, but I never had to walk along public streets, normal streets, well-lit streets at any time of day or night being particularly concerned. When I was much younger and went to a Rocky Horror Picture Show dressed as Magenta, nobody took me aside and suggested it might be a little bit too revealing, that they might have sounded other notes of caution, but the skimpiness of the dress was not one of them. But this happens every year, and every year we must bemoan the fact that little, if anything, is done. Women in their 60s and 70s who had to put up with harassment when they were younger see young women 2 generations later having the same experiences. Some attitudes have changed, some laws have been implemented, but the problem has not gone away. But this year was very different. In the same week, remains were found of a woman who was abducted just walking home. And although this is not a common occurrence, it does happen. And when it happens, it only happens to women. And what has led to the political hot potato this weekend is that a serving police officer was arrested as prime suspect for the crime. This weekend, people wanted to hold a vigil, a silent vigil, mark the occasion, a silent protest against violence against women with a vigil on Saturday. Organisers spent a lot of effort trying to work things out with the Metropolitan Police. They worked on ideas of shifts to minimise the number of people present at any one time. No dice. The police weren't interested, you can't hold it. Never mind the fact that similar events took place around the country where other police forces were found ways to accommodate it. The Metropolitan Police couldn't care less. And let's consider a few things here. The argument was to protect public safety. And there have been times when we've frowned on the notion of large groups of people gathering in the wake of the pandemic, of course, although that is a public health issue, not a public safety issue. And that's where some people have pointed out that police use public order legislation to justify their actions when it's not a public order issue, it's a public health issue that they are claiming. But here's the thing. People in attendance were wearing masks. They were entirely outdoors. You will not now find an expert on the matter saying that the vigil would have been a high risk. The risk of transmission outdoors is so low that no outbreak has ever been linked to an outdoor gathering. I absolutely got, and I shared the view myself when we looked last year at lots of, the packed beaches and so on. Oh, why do people have to do that? Now we know that the risk was very low. Now, okay, people will point out, but what about the Cheltenham Festival last year? It had large crowds in indoor areas as well. The packed beaches last summer, on the other hand, like I said, produced no outbreaks of the virus. We know that now. Now, because we know that, and again, low risk isn't the same as no risk. I don't want to, I'm always wary about when I sort of say this, because then people go, oh, that means we just go outside and do whatever we want. It doesn't mean no risk. You still have to balance the risk with what you're doing. And that's why the wearing of masks massively reduced. When you're outdoors and wearing a mask, as far as I can tell from every public health expert pronouncing on the situation right now, the risk is deemed to be negligible. Because we talked, even when we're indoors, have good ventilation. You don't get better ventilation than outdoors, especially as at the moment in Britain it's quite windy. It's so windy that our pineapple blew away, in fact. My partner's pineapple. I was all up for going next door and saying, may we have our pineapple back? It's almost like I've waited my whole life to knock on a stranger's door and say, may we have our pineapple back, please? Unfortunately, I had a little look over the garden fence, couldn't see it, so it's blown away somewhere. If you see an inflatable pineapple blow past your window, it's ours. But, you know, there's no way the police, the point is, could argue that a socially distanced, not necessarily 2 meters apart, but a socially distanced vigil attended by people wearing masks is a higher risk than the people who during the daytime in the same general area were packing out the high streets and the markets. Most not even wearing masks because they don't have to. Now, why didn't the police stop all those people going out shopping, for example, if it's such an issue? Now, I'm not going to comment on the motivation behind the police refusing to allow the vigil. I will say how it looks. Police officer accused of murdering woman who was just walking home, minding her own business. Police force refuses to allow group of women to protest at the alleged actions of said police officer. At this point, it is already a terrible look. It's a really, really bad look not allowing the vigil to go ahead. But the vigil happened anyway. At that point, the police need to make a decision on how they were going to police it. Some people insisted on being there. The police were being unreasonable. And then they made their decision. The scenes that were plastered all over the front pages of yesterday's Sunday newspapers. Police officers stormed the group, silently protesting women, and they stormed them, trampling their floral tributes, wrestling women to the ground. Were this a protest against Brexit or the climate emergency or in aid of Black Lives Matter, the Conservatives would have said that those people should not have been there. They would have condemned the protesters, of course, as indeed they have done in the case of these protests. But they can safely say that because the protests would have been almost exclusively attended by those who actively vote against Conservative candidates. There was no safety in such a comment this weekend. Many of those attending would have been Conservative voters who are simply ignorant of the fact that Conservatives don't give a crap about women any more than ethnic minorities or anyone whose bank balance has fewer than 8 digits. Sure, you see some representation in senior positions in the party, but only if they know their place within the white patriarchy. Even their female leaders were treated differently. When a male leader needs to go, it's done quietly with dignity. You need to go now. You'll see how it is with Boris Johnson. Both Thatcher and May were assassinated in the most humiliating public way imaginable. It's almost like the Conservatives hated themselves for having supported a female leader and wanted to release their pent-up self-loathing when it no longer seemed necessary to have done so. But anyway, I digress. On this occasion, the government dared not condemn the protesters, so they've had to condemn the police. There'll be no major section of the public, even Conservative voting public, who will have approved of the police action. And women are a massive chunk of their voter base. So the Home Secretary condemns the police. The Met Chief, who is also a woman, may well have to resign unless she adopts a rather more intelligent PR approach after the event than she did beforehand. Cressida Dick, who must have known that rushing the protesters would invite deeply damaging headlines, and on a Sunday, when more people read the newspapers than on any other day, she must have known how damaging it would be, surely. That's what always gets me about these things. Not just how awful it was that the police behaved in this way, but how stupid it was. These are the people charged with our safety, and the brightest thing about them is their cat badges. It's not a slight to all police officers, of course, but still, in this particular case, it was rank stupidity. But although the cretinous and heavy-handed police response is grabbing the headlines, I'm not seeing a lot of the mainstream media linking the story with the fact that the government are pushing through legislation that can make any protest unlawful, with a penalty of up to 10 years in prison. The language in the bill means that if you protest in a way that even causes annoyance, and yes, that is the word in the bill, then you can face arrest and 10 years in prison. I mean, anything can be an annoyance. The government annoy me. Now, I'm going to guess that marchers will be difficult to ban. After all, what is a march but walking down a street? Sure, I get that 1 million people marching down a street can be annoying to some people. But how do you arrest individuals for that? You're just walking down a public street. It's not your fault that there's hundreds of thousands of others doing the same thing at the same time. But I don't know, I'm not a legal expert. What I do know is this: the legislation is designed to be deliberately vague, that the government can use it to outlaw any protest against either them or a cause they don't believe in, but allow protests on matters that are in line with their beliefs. You could almost see the proof of this because government ministers can't even make sense of it themselves. One was doing an interview yesterday where they said, no, all this is, it's like an update, because basically they're updating the legislation from 1986. There's, in 1986, it's really to ban people like gluing themselves to railings and things like that. I mean, no one could have foreseen in 1986 that people would glue themselves to railings. Are you having a laugh? The most famous protest in British history, in the cause of women's suffrage was someone chaining themselves to railings. What? How can you say that wasn't foreseeable in 1986? It happened nearly 100 years before then. But anyway, never mind that. The other reason is that this bill refers to noise. So if a protest is noisy, the bill argues, which any protest is, so if it's noisy and annoying, which all protests are to some people, I'll say you can't have it. So what they're arguing is, well, if it's noisy, it could be disruptive to people working in nearby offices. And the noisiest protesters, as pointed out by Ian Dunt, writing in politics.co.uk, are those aimed at politicians, particularly in Westminster, particularly the government. Because the bulk of such protests are generally aimed at opposing government policies. So when the government are pushing through particularly unpopular legislation, you'll get protests around Westminster shouting and making sure MPs can hear them inside. So this legislation is a targeted assault against anti-government protests of the sort that are planned from this June, for example. So Black Lives Matter protesters could find themselves imprisoned. Extinction Rebellion, definitely. Anti-Brexit or just anti-conservative protesters will find our activities severely curtailed. But anti-mask protests, nah, leave them alone. But those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the pineapple, the like button. We want the pineapple back, please. Until next time, I'll see you later.